been promoting historic preservation, urban revitalization, and smart growth since 1973. If you're not currently a member of Historic Harrisburg, you can find information on our website at www.historicharisburg.org. This event is part of Historic Harrisburg's longstanding Fourth Monday free education series, which dates back to 1973. In addition to February being Black History Month, February 22nd, today, happens to be the 48th anniversary of the founding of our association. Historic Harrisburg has a very small staff, but a lot of great volunteers. Tonight's program was arranged by our Education Committee, chaired by Dr. Dorothy King, with assistance from our Communications Committee, co-chaired by Julian Salinas and Shane Gallagher. Shane is serving as a producer of tonight's program. This program is sponsored by the Foundation for Enhancing Communities, or TFEC, whose generous support extends to all of our African American heritage initiatives last year and this year. And now, for a message on behalf of TFEC, we welcome its president and CEO, Janice Black.
Hi, David. Good evening. The Foundation for Enhancing Communities is very pleased to support tonight's program, as well as Historic Harrisburg Association's broader ongoing efforts to preserve and promote Harrisburg's African American heritage, beginning with your activities last year to salute the contributions of Caleb, Jackson, and others. Our organization, which began as the Greater Harrisburg Foundation in 1920, is now in its second century of encouraging and channeling philanthropic support, involving literally thousands of donors and hundreds of charities and causes throughout central Pennsylvania. We are more than honored to do that for the community and this region. Through tonight's program, we are pleased to honor Barbara Barksdale by supporting the Friends of Midland Cemetery, the oldest Black cemetery in central Pennsylvania, and the Commonwealth Monument Project, which in actuality we have been assisting since its inception by serving as the fiscal agent. If you have not seen it yet, and I hope you have, I encourage you to go down by the Capitol on the Irvis side of the Capitol and look at the beautiful statues and feel their strength and purpose while you stand there with them. It's really exhilarating. We're so lucky to have it. Every day, the Foundation for Enhancing Community helps people from all walks of life to achieve their charitable goals and partner with established organizations like Historic Harrisburg or unincorporated, unstaffed entities like the Commonwealth Monument Project to achieve their charitable goals in the community. In closing, I want to commend Historic Harrisburg and David Morrison and his great team for continuing their work in the preservation of Harrisburg's African American heritage. And I sincerely thank them for their excellent ongoing work. Thank you, David.
David, please unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Janice. And as Janice mentioned, TFEC has earmarked $500 donations for both the Friends of Midland Cemetery and the Commonwealth Monument Project. These two landmarks of African American heritage will benefit equally and exclusively from Historic Harrisburg's 48th anniversary campaign, which we launched earlier this month and we will be conducting for the next 2 weeks, and which we invite you to support by visiting our website. And by the way, in addition to thanking TFEC and Janice, we thank the many donors who have already contributed both by mail and online to this special initiative. We're so pleased that we're able to support these very important landmarks of African American heritage. Tonight's program will be introduced in just a moment by Dr. Dorothy King. We regret that one of our speakers, Caleb Jackson, is just a few days out of the hospital following gallbladder surgery. So his presentation will be very ably covered by the other two speakers. And Caleb, I'm sure you're listening, and we wish you a speedy and complete recovery. And we look forward to having you in future Historic Harrisburg programs. And to our audience tonight, your comments and questions are welcome via our Q&A chat room. Type directly into the box at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the program, your questions to our speakers will be moderated by Shane Gallagher. Now, please welcome Education Chair, Dr. Dorothy King. Dorothy?
Yes, hello. Thank you, David. Our first presenter will be Barbara Barksdale. She is the Director of Historic Midland Cemetery. And as Ms. Black has already pointed out, it is the resting place for African Americans from slavery times through World War II. Barbara is a genealogist, and she gets many requests from people all over the world to help put together their family trees with their relatives here in the central Pennsylvania area. She's also a Civil War interpreter. She has consulted and participated in many documentaries that center on African American history and culture. She's a good friend of HHA, and she's participated in several programs that we've done here. Our second presenter is Norman Kelker. He is also a very good friend of HHA and has written research that he's done for us here at HHA. He's been chronicling his family history here in central Pennsylvania and around the world. He has much to share with you this evening about his family's involvement in the Underground Railroad here in central Pennsylvania. With that, I will invite Barbara Barksdale to begin our program.
All right. Slideshow. All right, can everybody see that right now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right. Just never know when you're working with these things here. Let's get this out the way. All right, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to move things around here. All righty, anyway, thank you. Good evening, everybody. I hope that we have a nice attendance and that we have the time to learn something and ask lots of questions at the end. But let me start off, first of all, by saying thank you to the Historic Harrisburg Association, along with Dr. Dorothy King, David Morrison, and Shane, and everybody else. And also to you, Janice. Thank you so much for the donation for Midland Cemetery and also for the monument that is downtown on Walnut Street, because I'm a part of that also. So I'm a little bit of everything. It seems like I'm like butter on a hot street. I'm just melted all over the place, and hopefully I still taste good, you know, at the end. So thank you. Anyway, as you see, it's going to be presented not only by myself, but also by Caleb Jackson's not going to be here. So, you know, I'm sure you'll still get the taste and flavor of what we're all about and what we're trying to do as far as sharing the history. I just want to give you, from my standpoint, and I'm trying to figure out how to get this down. There we go. Alrighty. A little history about the people that were enslaved here in Pennsylvania. And before I even get started in that, and I know my time is limited, but I must say, do you know that there is another major anniversary that is coming up on March the 1st? I know there's some nods of heads probably saying, or let's say shaking of heads and saying no. You don't know what I'm talking about. Well, what I'm talking about is the fact that on March the 1st, the Pennsylvania Assembly, let me go back here. Now, I'm trying to move these here pictures out the way. The Pennsylvania Assembly had passed a law for the gradual emancipation of slaves born here in Pennsylvania. And so what they were trying to do is to make sure that the slaves became free. And that gradual emancipation happened March the 1st in 1780. So 241 years ago. So that is another moment to celebrate, along with the Historic Harrisburg Association. And that is one of those things that kind of pulls us to what we're talking about here today. On March the 1st of 1780, any child born to a slave mother after March the 1st of that date was not considered a slave, but an indentured servant. That indentured servant, that child, would become in servitude until the age of 28. Now, that is if that child was totally Black. if that child was a mulatto, it was going to be enslaved, or let's say indentured, until it was at least in its early 30s, 31. So those are some of the things that came out from 1780. Unfortunately, they also had, and I have to say fortunately, but unfortunately, it's like one of those oxymoron things, is the fact that we had these children that were, if they were not registered here in Pennsylvania, that they were, at least by the age of 6 months, they were automatically considered free. Now, if you have a mother who is that slave for life, because February the 28th and before, everybody was going to be that slave for life, do you think that child was going to just be tossed to the side or raised on by itself? No, that child was going to have to be raised by that parent, or if that child was going to be, I can't say sold, but how was that child or those children going to be able to take care of themselves? So that was a situation that was, I'm sure, in the minds of some of the parents that was dealing with this child is somewhat free, indentured, but I am, as a parent, still enslaved here in Pennsylvania, because that was the slave for life law or situation. Here we have a census record. You know what's driving me crazy here is this little thing here. Let me get out of the way. All right. Anyway, this is an 1810 census record, and it shows Dauphin County having, and I'm sure that, let me just show this. Let me see if I can do this here. Here in Dauphin County, take a look. In 1810, there was 8 slaves registered. That means that they went to the office. They said, I only have 8 slaves living here. And that might not be from just one part of Dauphin County. It could be from spread all over. And here you had slaves. And if you take a look here at the very top, it says free colored persons. Right here you have underneath, you have York, Pennsylvania. They had 9 slaves, 778 free people. In Cumberland County, as you know, it's right across the river. They had 28, and they also had 717 free people of color. The problem with this is that they don't have a line for those people that were indentured. And, you know, indentured and free is not the same. Indentured means that they're going to have to work until they were 28. All right, in Cumberland County, like I said, right across the river. And you know, Dauphin County is right up against that property across the river as you go across the bridge. That is all Dauphin County until you get on the other side of the bridge, here in Harrisburg area at least. And here, what I have is a tax, well, actually it's an estate record, and it's showing the estate of a Thomas Cassello. This estate record is from 1789, July, let me see, down here at the very bottom, July 31st of 1789. Take a look at what he owns. He owns some cattle, he owns a table, he owns a little bit of this and that for a household. But at the very bottom here, he has 4 Negroes at $50 each, $200. Then he has 2 Negroes at $80 each, $160. His estate was not very big, except for the amount of money that could be brought in by the Negroes that he owned in 1789. Keep in mind, we had went through March 1st of 1780, the gradual emancipation of these slaves, but these people obviously were still under the category of being slaves for life. I'm saying all this even though I know we're talking about the Underground Railroad, because you cannot understand the Underground Railroad without knowing what the basis is, what the foundation is. Here is an ad that was being run, and this is from 1835. Well, yeah, this is a freedom seeker. This is a person who was running away, as it says in this newspaper article, in Londonderry Township, Dauphin County. This is John Conrad. Now, I did try to find John Conrad. There's a lot of John Conrads in Dauphin County, and there's quite a few down there in Middletown. But unfortunately, I could not find this particular Conrad that I can say decisively that this is the John Conrad that is in this here program. He ran off. He was only 17 years of age. It says fair complexion, stoutly built, and he took with him a variety of clothing. And they were going to pay 6 cents for him. Henry Smith obviously had a farm down there, and obviously he said he wanted his property back. And unfortunately, this person who was born in 1818, when I did the math on him, 17 from 1835, it was 1818. Unfortunately, even though he was considered supposedly by law, that person who was indentured, he didn't have the rights to just wander off and go anywhere because he was not of that proper age. And then we come into this particular one here in 1806. If you take a look through here, we have a Charles. Charles don't even get a last name. He was living here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in Dauphin County. And he was 40 years old. And poor Charles obviously wanted to get away, but unfortunately, Charles was, he had marks on his cheeks. He was an African Negro, as they said, and he is fondly, and he loves whiskey, according to this. And he gets to talk to all kinds of different things. And when he's talkative, and he's talks through his nose when he is a little intoxicated. And of all the people, Joshua Elder was his owner. Now, I don't know how many of you know about Joshua Elder or even the Elder family. For some of you are probably saying, oh yeah, I know about them or the Elder family. They're out there at, most of them are buried in the churchyard behind the Paxton Church, Presbyterian Church, the one that George Washington had went to. And Joshua Elder, along with 4 other clerks, were the ones who were the clerks of peace, meaning that they were going to be the persons who registered all of the slaves that were here in Dauphin County. And in fact, Joshua Elder was labeling these people, or was able to document these people from March of 1800 all through January of 1809. So he's documenting these people, but at the same time, he and some of his family members also had their own amount of slaves that they kept, who were considered those who were slaves for life. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter what your position is, that you can still do what you want to do. And here he says, whoever takes up said Negro and secures him, so that his master may have him again, shall receive the above reward, and all reasonable charges paid by Joshua Elder. Quite sad when it's your own history in your own neighborhood. And in fact, if you want to get a chance to go up there and visit him, you can take a look at, go up to the church, and he's out there in the backyard along with John Harris. And then I found this here clippings some years ago concerning in the Harrisburg Telegraph. And this actually was from 1871. And again, it's one of those situations where you're like, I can't believe this is actually happening. I can't believe this is part of our history, being American history, being that it is history that affects Dauphin County, because I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, I didn't know there were slaves here. I didn't know that there were slaves in Pennsylvania. Yes, there was. Now, this one here is a clipping actually that they had written about somebody who was a slave in 1803. And here you have a healthy Negro wench, slave for life. She is an excellent washer, baker, cook, and well acquainted with all kinds of housework. If you want her, you can go to the printer and they'll give you all the particulars so that you can buy her. That's a horrible thing to feel, especially coming from on my side of the fence, because I can only imagine some of my own ancestors being used in this here regards as the person who had to cook and clean and nurse and take care of somebody's family and didn't have the right or the privilege to go about your life as you want to do normally. So when you think about this, I also think about the people that are buried in that same cemetery with John Harris and the Elder family and such like that, because in the very far back part of that particular cemetery are two headstones that actually refers to their interred back there as slaves for life. They're in the back, and it's George and Lucy Lorette, I think it is Lorret, and they're in the back corner next to the brick wall. And it says on their headstone, slaves for life. That is enough just to make your heart break, because no matter when they died, either before or after the Civil War, they were just enslaved and couldn't get their freedom. On this particular one, this slide here, if you take a look at the top, which is very hard to read, it actually says male slaves. And then midway down, it has female slaves. You have a Charles. I'm not sure about the second name, and George, John, Jack, and Peter. And for the females, it's like Toby, Ingrid, Mary, and I believe it's Viola. I'm not sure, but if you take a look at how old they were at that time, and you're doing the math, because this is from 1800s, this is the tax records. They were all in that age range where they were slaves for life. So the thing is, I get to thinking about, wow, the slaves for life, but yet and still there's people that's trying to get free. How many of these people actually tried to get free? These were on the tax return, taxable inhabitants and slaves, as it says right here, in Sweater Township in Dauphin County. And unfortunately, these people do not get to have a last name. They are just people that were enslaved. And how many did you think about was going to say, oh my, how do we get them out of here? How do they get to have their freedom, despite the fact that they're supposed to be enslaved until they died? And this is a picture that I had found along the way of freedom seekers. And it does not mean that they were always coming from other states. They could have been coming from Cumberland County. They could have been trying to get to Perry County, for that matter. They could have been obviously coming to Dauphin County and up the river, just trying to get even to New York or Canada. But we also have those slaves that were right here in Dauphin County at the time that was trying to get from maybe Fort Hunter to try to find some place way up the mountains, just to get away, to have that freedom to just say that they were human beings. How did they go? Did they go by waterway? Did they go by wagons? Did they go by foot? And of course, most of the time, I'm sure that they were going by foot, trying to get that safe haven. They were trying to find that abolitionist, whether they were black or white or what, anybody who was going to be free and giving and caring to take care of them. You know, Pennsylvania is so full of caverns and hills and mountains, and in betweens, there are the towns and the cities and everything else that possibly could show them a place of safe haven. Especially here, when you think about going back in time and you think about how Dauphin County was, that you know, we have Indian Echo caverns, and they could have been hiding in there. You know, they could have been hiding along the rivers and caverns that we had here that are probably now filled in. But in either case, these freedom seekers were constantly trying to get to some safe haven, or maybe trying to even get to their own family that they know was coming into our area. And that they also knew that they were someplace where they could possibly have a little time to rest and recoup. Maybe their feet were bleeding from running. It could be that they were just hungry. They wanted to take care of themselves. Maybe they had their child with them and whatever. But it's unfortunate that they had to go through that. But hopefully this was one of their places where they could have a safe haven and find somebody that could help take care of them. Which leads me on to this. Now I'm going to show you this. This is on Ignatius Thomas, Mr. Thomas. It says the last ex-slave in Waverly, Pennsylvania. Now I found this a while ago, and it's so crazy because I was talking with Caleb, and Caleb has something very similar. In fact, Caleb, thank God for Caleb, that he actually found one that is on the same gentleman, but it's worded a little bit differently. All right. This one is basically saying that he was the last slave. He died on May the 26th at the age of 85. And he was born in slavery in Maryland. And he left his master in 1845. And it talks a little bit about how he came here and everything, and where he ended up being after a number of years, and what happened to his children. But let me show you this next slide, and then think about how you can compare the two, especially if you're into genealogy and what the story of these people are going to tell you. Okay. And I know it's mighty small, so let me just kind of give you a little synopsis of what it's saying. His life journey. He was born a slave around 1812. All right, you know what was going on around 1812 here in America. So I don't even need to go through that. He was born in Maryland, just like I had mentioned before. This is the same man, but this one has a lot more information to share with you. All right. He was born to a slave mother. All right. And unfortunately, because they were in Maryland, they had not yet had the emancipation going on down there. His parent, his mom and he were working for, were not working for, but were enslaved by a man by the name of William Dorsey. He then went on to, was sold over to the Hawkins, I don't even know how to say this name, the Jew or whatever, at the age of 18. And then Dr. Thomas Clickett, who purchased him from this, from Mr. Hawkins. All right. And you would think with a doctor who would have maybe more compassion for a human being, obviously he wasn't all that good, because then Mr. Thomas ran away from him in 1845 at the age of 33. It has that information right here in this here clipping. Now envision this. Work with me on this, okay? You're traveling up the Route 15. Now, most of you have been down Route 15 if you lived here in Harrisburg or somewhere close by. And as you're going through the mountains, you're going into, let's say you're coming from Maryland, you're coming from past Harrisburg and Thurmont. You know, when I think of Thurmont, I think about the little restaurant that's down in the valley there. You're coming into Adams County and you're skirting over to York County, and then you're going right on into Dauphin County. But how's he going to get to Dauphin County? Keep in mind, Dauphin County is right up against York County and also Cumberland County waterway on the other side of the river. So he hits Dauphin County line. He's coming across the Susquehanna River into Middletown. All right. Now, if you know the landscape, you're talking about maybe what's Goldsboro and those places over there across, come up the river, a little bit, trying to get into the bottom end of Middletown near the Sweater Creek. So he is a strong man. He's made it up this far. He's coming to Middletown, and by the grace of God, he had gotten the name of a William Jones who aided him to get him. Now, Mr. Jones was a Black man, and I did find him. I found his marriage license and everything else, and Mr. Jones was married, and he was a laborer, a weaver. And so he was able to get him over to a Samuel Rutherford. Now, I know you've heard about the Rutherford House, and you know that at the Rutherford House, it sits on top of the hill near Paxton Street here in Harrisburg, and you know where the mall is at. So keep in mind where all these little landmarks are. So he got him up to Samuel Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, according to this clipping, says that that Mr. Thomas was able to stay with him for 6 months, only 6 months, because of the slave catchers that were in the area, and they were worried about him being taken back into Maryland. Now, this here area that Mr. Rutherford had, they had him near, as an abolitionist, had him near a place called the Poorhouse. And if you recall the landscape, maybe even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was the Dauphin County house or building that basically that was for the elderly people. And that had been the poorhouse at one time. And that's where a lot of people that didn't have family, they were, homeless or whatever, they were placed there, or elderly. And it actually became the the old folks' home. So that's where the landscape goes. And think about Rutherford, you think about the poorhouse, and you think about how this man came across the Susquehanna River in Middletown into the Harrisburg area and was able to locate Mr. Rutherford and be taken care of. He was able not only to come here, but he was also able to move up north, and he went to the area of Wilkes-Barre. If you take a look right in here that I'm kind of wiggling on, and he met other people that was able to help him over his lifetime. He worked for them. He ended up with a house near Waverly, Pennsylvania, and basically that's where he stayed at until he died. However, I found other clippings where he came back into Harrisburg over the years to go to the AME church. His son actually became an AME minister in Waverly, and they did have 2 other children before he left out of, or let's say before he started doing his freedom seeking moments. He actually went back down to Maryland, retrieved his wife, but his children were already sent out west through, I'm not sure if they were sold off or if they were indentured to somebody else, because you could take off somebody else's indentured person, whether you want to call it a slave or not, but they sent them on someplace else. They never got to see their children again from that standpoint. So anyway, folks, and my time is almost up, and I'm sorry, I have so much I would love to tell you, but unfortunately, I don't have all the time. But if you ever get a chance, and this is what I need you folks to do for me, if you ever get a chance to find documentation such as this is so wonderful to see that there is so much bits of information that you can actually go in and really dig and pull it apart and create the whole livelihood or life of these people. And we're trying to make sure that this information is not only salvaged and found in records and papers or family books and family telling stories or whatever. We need this information to be passed on not only to the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds Project, which we are taking care of cemeteries across the state of Pennsylvania, but also to the National Park Service with the Underground Railroad Network, because they're the ones who's going to hopefully have all these records documented and also be able to place those notes around the state of Pennsylvania that indicates that there is a freedom seeker possibly buried here. I shouldn't say possibly, but they are buried here in a particular cemetery like Midland Cemetery, because we do have noted slaves or those who were enslaved buried at Midland Cemetery. It is very important that this information is shared, because if there's other people like myself that are constantly digging and researching, we want to make sure that this stuff is not lost just in my computer or in my head, but it's also shared with the rest of the world. So it's very important that you do share that information with everybody. We want to make sure that everybody is connected, that these people are no longer forgotten, that they were just as important as the Booker T. Washingtons and all the other notable people that you know of and celebrate every year, but those other people that really made the way to get that freedom. And we can only do that if we work together as a team. So please help out the Underground Railroad Network with the National Park Service through the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds Project, and just make sure that we are striving to make sure that this here documentation is taken care of. So at this point, folks, I am beyond my time, and I am going to turn this over to Norman Kelker, who is a fabulous historian of his family history, and that will be that. And I hope you got something out of what I had to share with you.
Shane, I need to upload my
Yeah.
slides.
You can start sharing now.
I push share screen.
Yep. I just stopped Barbara, so it should let you.
Okay. And oh, here it is, I think. Aha, here we go. Okay, I'm having a hard time getting them expanded because it is,
So it's under slideshow.
yeah, I want a large screen and I can't get to that because it's covered
Click on
by the
slideshow there at the top banner, or you can just hit F5 and that'll do it too.
F5.
Yep.
Ah, it does it. Great. Okay, I'm going, Barbara, that's fantastic. You're a real scholar and your knowledge and your presentation is extremely impressive. And you set a high standard. I'm going to talk about the Rutherford families and the Kelker families and their roles in the slave history of Pennsylvania. But before I begin, I'd like to thank David, Chris, Christy, Shane, and Dr. King for putting together this program, which is really a great opportunity for me. And I also like to thank the Historical Society of Dauphin County with Ken Frew, Eric Fossick, and Rick Hartman. Ken Frew has been extremely helpful to me. And of course, Barbara for her wonderful presentation. And Caleb, I want you to get well. I've also been helped by a friend of mine, an expat who lives in Warsaw, Poland, and does a lot of my editing for me. His name is Alan Lockwood. He's a writer, not very knowledgeable in literature, and he knows the publishing business, and he's been really helping me out. So thank you, Alan. Well, I think tuning in are not familiar with Harrisburg or Pennsylvania, and I want to just point out for those people exactly where Harrisburg is. It's the capital of Pennsylvania. It's got a population of 50,000. If you look, one marker would be Hershey, if you ever heard of the Hershey Candy Bar Company or the Hershey Park or the Hershey Medical Center. Those are landmarks close to. And it's about 100 miles west-northwest of Philadelphia. Now, I'm going to be talking about Harrisburg, but I'm also going to be talking about Swatara Township, which is this large area west and south, east and south of Harrisburg. And because I want to talk about a slave incident that happened there. And you'll also note here the Susquehanna River, the wide flowing Susquehanna. Another geographical marker here is 3 Mile Island, which is just right down here. But I'm sorry. To get started, I want to talk about the Rutherford family. It was they were all abolitionists. The Scottish Rutherfords were among the first settlers in the Paxtang Valley. And in 1755, Thomas Rutherford purchased a tract of land in Paxtang. And in the 1840s, his grandsons, I think it were his grandsons. Barbara was talking about Samuel Rutherford, and his brother Abner had farms in Paxtang on the property that Thomas Rutherford had purchased. And Dr. William Rutherford, who had a home at 11 South Front Street in Harrisburg, had a home in Harrisburg, and he also had a house and a farm in Paxtang. Now, the Rutherford brothers, all 4 of them, were active abolitionists and very active in the Underground Railroad. I'm going to talk about Dr. William Rutherford and Dr. Hiram Rutherford. And I mentioned Samuel and Abner, who had farms in Paxtang. Now, Dr. William Rutherford received runaways at his Harrisburg home at 11 South Front Street, and then he sent them on to his brother Samuel's dairy farm in Paxtang. He also received runaways at his home in Paxtang, and the runaways would even appear at his store, or they would be sent there by conductors. He had good abolitionist credentials. He served as vice president of the Harrisburg Anti-Slavery Society. And in 1847, he arranged for abolitionists Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison to speak in Harrisburg at that very well-known event. Now, I'm going to talk about a slave incident that happened on his farm in Paxtang. 10 runaways appeared at his farm, And they included an elderly man and his 6 mulatto sons. The youngest was 18. There were 2 brothers and a man who's described as a very dark man. The conductors were to pick them up on Saturday. This is in October of 1845. The conductors were to pick them up on a Saturday, but they didn't show up. So Rutherford said, that's fine, they can stay over till the next day. I don't think anything will happen. And at 5 o'clock on the next day on Sunday evening, one of the young Rutherford boys at the farm delivered a basket of food to the runaways who were staying in the barn. They were up in the hayloft. And they all came down and to open the food basket. But just before they began to eat, 2 carriages and 4 horsemen were spotted coming down the road. The party then entered the Rutherford property at a gallop, and then the entering party were slave owners and slave hunters. Now, this is very, very rare occasion because the farm was so far out of the way that slave hunters almost never got there. But these guys had been tipped off by a waiter when they had lunch in Harrisburg. So they went out to Dr. Rutherford's farm. Rutherford was, Rutherford was introduced to a Mr. Buchanan, who was a Maryland slave owner, and they proceeded to have a discussion on the porch. They just proceeded to have a discussion on the front porch of the house. Now, 2 of the horsemen stood guard at the barn door, and the other 2 stood guard at the house. They certainly suspected that the runaways were in the barn. Well, following the discussion, Mr. Buchanan and another slaveholder and 4 of the men in the group went down to the barn and started calling out to the runaways in the loft. But they got no response, absolute quiet. They made calls, threats, promises, yelled, screamed, no response. And that was until nighttime. But while all of this was going on, 4 of the Underground Railroad conductors who were supposed to have arrived the day before suddenly showed up. And 2 of them were sent to the barn, and they were immediately arrested by the guards there. And the other 2 remained free and waited in the house behind the stove. Well, meanwhile, 6 of the 10 runaways came down from the loft and surrendered. Then the slave-hunting party then climbed the ladder to the loft, and with lanterns, they made a big search of the loft for the other 4 runaways, but 3 of them had slipped out of the barn and disappeared. And the 4th one had actually hid himself so well in the hayloft that he couldn't be found. And at midnight, the search ended and the slaveholders left with the 6 slaves. And presumably, I don't know about that, but maybe they took the 2 conductors with them as well. Well, in the meanwhile, Dr. Rutherford sent the other 2 conductors who had been in the house behind the stove back to Harrisburg and told them to get a posse together and get out here and catch the slaveholders. And they did. About 40 blacks came out. They were eager and ready to fight. But the slaveholders took an alternate route home, so they were never able to contact them. Now, I think this story points out a couple of things. It points out the determination of the slaveholders to get back their free labor. And it also shows the determination of the slaves to get out of their miserable existence and get on to freedom. And it also shows that some people, like the Rutherfords, put themselves in harm's way, faced danger, and showed extreme courage in trying to help these poor slaves get on to freedom. Now, I'm next going to talk about Hiram Rutherford, who was the youngest brother of the 4. And as I said, he was born in 1815, and he was a physician. And in 1840, he left the Harrisburg area and he moved to Illinois. Before he was an abolition and a physician. He worked as a child, living at 11 South Front Street. He worked on the Underground Railroad. But in 1840, he moved to Illinois. And there, he participated in a very famous, well-known slave proceeding known as the Matson trial. And it's extremely well known because Abraham Lincoln participated in the trial, and he was an attorney for the slaveholder. So the great emancipator was working for the slaveholder. This is where Hiram Rutherford went in Illinois, in Oakland, Illinois, in 1840, and he built this house in 1846. Now, the Matson trial, in which Hiram Rutherford participated, went like this. A slaveholder from Kentucky who had a large plantation there and employed slaves moved from Kentucky to Illinois in 1836, Robert Matson. Now, Illinois was a free state. If you lived in Illinois, you were free. But Matson, at his estate in Illinois, employed slaves. And what he did was, you could keep slaves for a certain period of time, but then in Illinois, but then you had to free them or send them back. So he would keep slaves at his Illinois estate for a year. And at the end of the year, he would send them back to Kentucky and bring in a new batch of slaves. Well, anyhow, Matson, the slaveholder, had working for him a black slave, freed slave, named Anthony Bryant, who was sort of his man Friday. He was a good superintendent, a good organizer, and he was very important to the operation. Now, Bryant was free, but he was living in Illinois with his family, who were still slaves and working for slave master Matson. Well, one day, Mrs. Bryant's wife got into a fight with one of Matson's housekeepers, and the fight escalated. It got bad. So Bryant just moved his whole family out of the place, just escaped. And they moved in with Hiram Rutherford at his house. Well, Matson was quite upset about the whole deal, and he got the legal gears rolling, but he was able to get the Bryant family out of Hiram Rutherford's house and into prison, into jail. And then he sued for their return. Well, Hiram Rutherford, who was a strong abolitionist, and his abolitionist attorney friend Gideon Ashmore went to the defense of the Bryant family. Now, Abraham Lincoln, early on, had volunteered to work with Rutherford and Ashmore, but Rutherford rejected him, so Lincoln became an attorney for the slaveholder. Well, the trial ended with a judge freeing all the Bryant family from slavery. He ruled that they had lived in Illinois 2 years. Illinois was a free soil state, and they were free. Matson was absolutely furious. He moved out of Illinois and back to his Kentucky place. And he was so angry, he refused to pay his attorney. So Abraham Lincoln got stiffed on his service for Robert Matson. Bryant's family, after the trial, moved to Liberia. And apparently they were unhappy in Liberia. They wanted to move back, but they were unable to, and they lived out their lives in Liberia. So I think this speaks so well for the Rutherford families. They were such outstandingly strong and determined for abolition. And maybe the Historic Harrisburg Association and the Historical Society of Dauphin County should maybe spend a little bit more time promoting their history, because they were really a wonderful family. Well, now I'm going to talk about the Kelkers. and slavery. I'm going to talk about, oh, sorry. Oh. I'm going to talk about early family that arrived in this country. A first generation born in this country was Rudolph Kelker. He was born in 1768 and he died in 1801. And he was supervised slaves at the Cornwall Iron Furnace in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. Now the contrast here is that his nephew, Rudolph Frederick Kelker, who was born in 1820, died in 1906, who was a lifelong resident and very good citizen of Harrisburg, was a station master on the Underground Railroad. So there is the contrast. Here's the history. Anthony Kelker arrived in this country in 1743. He was 10 years old. And he married from Zurich, Switzerland. He married another Swiss immigrant, Mary Magdalena Meister. And they had 7 children, one of whom was the Rudolph, who I just mentioned. And his youngest child was Frederick, who moved to Harrisburg in the late 1700s, got into the hardware business. And he was the progenitor of the 4 generations of Kelkers who lived in Harrisburg. And there were the 5 siblings. Now, Rudolph Kelker was apparently a bright young man. He, in his teen years, he worked in some government offices as a clerk. Oh my God, sorry. He worked in some government offices as a clerk, and then he worked in his father, Anthony Kelker's sheriff's office. Anthony Kelker was the first sheriff of Dauphin County, right after it split from Lancaster County. And according to the family record, he performed great service. Of course, I can see some bias there, but that's what the family record says. And at age 23, he was hired to work at the Cornwall Iron Furnace in Cornwall, Pennsylvania, near Lebanon. And he was apparently very bright because only 2 months after he was hired, he was promoted to being in charge of the charcoal furnace. The charcoal is absolutely an essential component of iron making. You need iron ore, you need limestone, and you need an air blast. And charcoal and the Cornwall Ironworks was a vast area. And it was heavily forested. So wood could be harvested, converted to charcoal, and then used in the blast furnace. The blast furnaces used an equivalent of 1 acre's worth of wood to charcoal every day. So producing charcoal was essential, and it was a huge job. And young Rudolph was put in charge of that operation. The ironworks also was situated on a huge load of iron ore. It finally ran out in the 1970s. And there was limestone on the property. Limestone is required for smelting or the removal of contaminants in the ore. And you need an air blast and charcoal to get the high temperature to produce the iron. And all of these were in abundance at the Cornwall site. Now, as head of charcoal production, Rudolph supervised white workers, indentured servants, free blacks, and black slaves. And one of his slaves was a collier. A collier is someone who makes charcoal, known as Governor Dick. And he did not produce charcoal at the charcoal furnace, which is right at the center of the operation, but he was located distally on Mount Gretna, which was on the iron furnace's property, but it was isolated from the rest of the operation. And Governor Dick worked there. He cut his own wood, he made his own charcoal, and apparently was a very important part of the process. But one day, Governor Dick took off, and he was never heard from again. And nobody knows where he went or what happened to him even to this day. But he must have been an important part of the operation because Rudolph Kelker put out a fugitive slave notice offering $20 for his return. And this is, oh, I'm sorry. This is the slave notice, which it's actually, you can, if you visit the Cornwall Ironworks Museum, this is on display there. $20 reward, ran away from Cornwall Furnace, Dauphin County on Sunday, 17th of April last. A Negro man called Dick, alias Governor Dick. He is an elderly man, bald-headed, about 5 feet 10 inches high, stout made, has a down look, is slightly marked on each of his temples with a small scores, I suppose scores are scars, usual to some of the natives of Africa, has large feet, and a remarkable scar on the great toe of his right foot, occasioned by its being split with an axe. He is by trade a rough carpenter and values himself greatly in that occupation. Had on when he went away a new drab colored coatee, I suppose that's a coat, with metal buttons, jacket, and overalls of the same, a new wool hat, and took with him some old clothes. And as he lived the early part of his life in Hartford County, state of Maryland, it is probable that he shaped his course to that quarter. He didn't go there, he shaped his course. I love the language. Whoever secures said Negro so that the owners may get him again shall receive the above reward and reasonable charges if brought home. Rudolph Kelker Jr., July 8th, 1876. Now, here is Rudolph's nephew, Rudolph Frederick Kelker, who was a great citizen of Harrisburg. He was born in 1820, died in 1906. On his resume, he was a founder of Ursinus College. He was a founder of the Harrisburg Hospital. He sold his property in Baldwin, which is now Steelton, for construction of the first steel mill in the United States, the Pennsylvania Steel Company. He developed the town of Steelton. He was a temperance advocate. He was the founder of the Salem Bible Class. He was the chairman of the board of trustees of the Lunatic Asylum. He was the treasurer of the Harrisburg City Railway. He was the Harrisburg secretary of the Soldiers Orphan Schools. And he was the founder of the Historical Society of Dauphin County and a founder of the Harrisburg YMCA. And he was a station master. Oh my God, I'm sorry. And he was a station master on the Harrisburg Underground Railroad. Now, unfortunately, there are no incidents associated with his being a station master. With the Rutherfords, we had two well-preserved incidents when they confronted slaves and slave masters. But with Rudolph Kelker, we have nothing. But this was his home at 9 South Front Street. And this picture was taken just before, in 1858, just before his house was destroyed. And then he built another house there. And the area is now occupied by the Dauphin County Courthouse. And right next door was Dr. William Wilson Rutherford, where he also had slaves at his house. Well, Rudolph Frederick Kelker sent his slaves from his home down here to his stable, which we think was located right here at the corner of Barbara and River Streets. This is Barbara Street looking west across the Susquehanna and River Street crossing. But unfortunately, we know very little else about him, and there's not much more to say about his interactions. But so that is those are the Rutherfords and the Kelkers, and I thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Barbara and Norman. We will now go to the Q&A session of our program. For those of you on Zoom, you can submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom. If you are tuning in on Facebook Live, simply post your question as a comment under the video. So we already have a few questions that have come in on Zoom. So Barbara and Norman, I will ask them and then see which of you is better equipped to answer them. And David, you of course can always chime in as well since you have a lot of background. So the first question we have is, was the 28 age systemic to all indentured servants in the United States, or was it specifically by contract between the indentured person and the master? And were there any differences between the states?
Hmm.
Barbara, do you have any background on this one? If I recall, I think you talked about that age a bit during your program.
Shane, this is David. I don't know a lot, but a couple of parts of that question I think I can answer. And
Right.
first of all, yes, there were definitely differences from state to state in terms of the length of servitude for the gradual elimination of slavery. And Dorothy, I know you and I were just talking about that a couple of days ago. The Pennsylvania had specific laws for the gradual elimination of slavery in the early 1800s, and so many years until you were free or reached a certain age and so forth. But it was different in every state. So I know that much. And so I have read that 28 was kind of the magic age, apparently, because
And David, it was, and I'm sorry, I had lost visual. I lost everything. I just finally got back in here.
good. Go ahead.
It's crazy, but yeah. Well, when you're thinking about indentured servitude here in Pennsylvania, that's the one I can talk to you about a little bit, okay? And that is only because that started, like I said, in 1780. Keep in mind, and you're asking about a contract. Well, think about this. These were those who were born to those people that were already enslaved, that had slavery for life. So they didn't have a contract per se. All they had was the fact that this slave owner was now going to say they're not a slave, but they're an indentured servant. And this is a person of color for that indentured servant. We're not talking about the indentured servant that was the white person that came on the ship who was going to use that time to get their American citizenship. We're not talking about that person who was here for 7 years or 10 years or however long he had to pay his expenses to get back and get out on his own freedom. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the person who was born, like I mentioned about that person earlier. That person was born to a slave. And if they were 6 months of age, how could they write up a contract? How could a child of 2 years old or 9 years old write up a contract? That person was just going to keep them on their plantation slash farm here in Pennsylvania until they were of that particular age of 28, or like I said, the mulatto in their ages of 30. So 31. So no, there wasn't a particular contract that they could have ever done. When you think about it logically, it could not have been done like that.
Let me jump in here also. It was known that Congress was going to end slave trade, not slavery. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, but the understanding was that Congress was going to end slave trade, meaning no more slaves would be allowed legally to come into the country in 1808. So Pennsylvania started a gradual Emancipation Act in 1780, which was 28 years prior to 1808. So that's where the 28 comes from. So slaves born, enslaved people born March 1st or after would be slaves. Barbara says indentured servants, slaves, whatever. They would be beholden to the slaveholder for 28 years. People born prior to that, before March 1st, 1780, would be slaves for life.
Mhm.
So I hope that answers the question, helps to answer the question.
Yes.
All right, they did indicate that it answered the question.
Okay.
So another question is, depending on on the state where the person resided, could indentured, especially when referring to people of color, be nothing more than another word for slave? And I think we kind of answered that as yes, but I'll just let
Yes.
someone chime in. Okay, we have another one that says, my great grandfather Thomas Burkett, BERKET /BURGETTE, was a fugitive slave from Hagerstown, escaped to Waverly, PA, 1840 to 44. Would he be considered a freedom seeker?
Yes. Short answer, yes.
All right. Another one is, what or who were sent out to find runaway slaves? Were they freelance capturers or were they part of a government agency?
Uh, as far as I know, they were like freelance. They were people that was hiring themselves out to say, "I'll go and catch your slave." But then we also had those people who were like the sheriffs or whatever, and they could detain those slaves and secure them for their owners or their agent to pick them up and buy maybe that freelance slave catcher and take them back to their master. Dorothy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say it also depends on the time, and I'm trying to remember the date of the second Fugitive Slave Act. I think the first one was 1790. I can't remember what the
It's
second one.
1789 is when they did an amendment to the one that was from 1780.
Okay, so what could happen then is with the second Fugitive Slave Act, the reason that it was so terrifying was that if you were an abolitionist, a marshal could come to you and say, I am going to deputize you and you will help me find these fugitive slaves. And if you don't do it, you will be held in contempt and you can either pay a fine or go to jail. So that was terrifying. It was terrifying to the people who were escaping, but it was also terrifying to the abolitionists. So it just depends on the time and history you're talking about. But yes, there were people who hired themselves out, who were like militias, who would look for fugitive slaves and try to bring them back because there was a reward for it. We saw some runaway slave ads. There was a reward for it. And with the second Fugitive Slave Act, they would impanel a judge or someone to make a determination as to whether or not an African American was a slave. I mean, you could have a free person who someone said, that's my slave. And the person was not a slave, but could not prove that she or he was not a slave because they could not testify in a court of law. So the people that made the determination as to whether or not the person was a slave, they would get paid more if they said, yes, in fact, this is a slave. So lots of times they just said, yes, this person is a slave.
It's almost like the story of 12 Years a Slave, where the person wasn't a slave. They took him because he was black. They sold him down south. And hence, as they say, being sold down the river, that's where it all came from, because they were selling them deep into the south where they couldn't get back. And then they were put in bondage because of the color of their skin.
Right.
So, and slave catchers, they wanted the money. Big money.
All right. Thank you. Next question is, do you have any knowledge of a barn on Nye Road being part of the Underground Railroad?
Norman, you want that one? Can you take yourself off of mute? You're not off of mute yet. There you go.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Do you have any knowledge of a barn on Nye Road in Harrisburg being used as part of the Underground Railroad?
What road, please?
Nyes, N-Y-E-S.
No, I have no knowledge of that.
There's only one barn that I know of down on the bottom end of Nice Road towards 22. It's sitting there on the corner, but I don't think it wasn't I doubt highly if it was, because it's a relatively new barn, something that was built over the last maybe 80 years.
Yeah.
We have a similar question, but different area. My family lived on Midland Road, Cave Hill, where a cave was under the house in Bellevue Park. We heard rumors that this was part of the railroad. Any information on this?
Not that I'm aware of. And yeah, we hear a lot of rumors. We hear a lot of things like, for instance, down in Middletown, there was a featured story on one of the local channels here in Harrisburg. And oh my God, everybody's like, it had to be the part of the Underground Railroad. And I'm sitting there looking at it on television, and as they're going in with their cameras and scanning the whole thing. And I'm like, there's no way in the world that that could have been part of the Underground Railroad. Because look at the beams. The beams are not old. Or like the barn that was on Barbara Street, came right near the Keystone Human Services. They said, oh, no, look at the materials that those things are made up of. They did not go back into the 1800s. They did not go back into the 1700s. So you have a lot of people that want to claim something, and then they can put something in for, because then they're going to get money for the maintaining and, to take care of that particular site, only to find out later it had nothing to do with the Underground Railroad. As far as there has been and Dorothy, you're in that region, I have never heard about a cave. Not to say it wasn't there, not to say it wasn't filled in, but I don't have any knowledge about it. Dorothy, you have any?
I don't know how, well, David, we'll talk in a second. I don't know how far back, Bellevue Park goes back to the early 1800s, but no, David's saying early 1900s. Sorry, early 1900s. So I don't know that it goes back farther than that, but I just want to say that one of the things about the Underground Railroad sites is that they were kept secret. So
Yeah.
we really don't know where many of them were. People wanted to protect themselves at the time. And so they oftentimes only knew where local sites were. They didn't know where sites were counties away, because they wanted to protect themselves. The other thing that I would urge people to do, if they think that they have a family site that might have been involved in the Underground Railroad, is to get in touch with the National Park Services. That's the agency that determines whether or not a site can be labeled as an Underground Railroad site. So if you think at all that it is, that's the agency that you need to be in touch with. I'm sorry, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I've also heard a story about the house in Bellevue Park with the cave house. In fact, it's even been on the historic Harrisburg house tour. And the write-up for the house tour even mentioned that it was supposedly an Underground Railroad stop. But, I think that's a legend, because only one house in Bellevue Park was built before 1900.
Right.
Not that house. A lot of houses in Harrisburg, particularly some of the mansions along Front Street, have great big underground caverns, which were probably for coal storage or something like that. And nothing to do with the Underground Railroad. It's something that people surmise because it looks like a place where you might hide people. But actually, the hiding places, I think, by and large, and not just Harrisburg, but everywhere, were not a permanent place, in part because you kind of had to keep changing it so people wouldn't find it. So it wasn't a special place that was created for the purpose of hiding slaves. It was much more makeshift than that. So I don't think these in fact, this building here at Historic Harrisburg has a big cavern under the sidewalk, and I think that was probably for dumping coal into the basement, but it certainly wasn't for hiding slaves either.
And you're right, David. Most of the time they were like in buildings, they were in attics, they were in the back behind the coal bin, down in High Spire, which is High Spire now, when General or Colonel Berg used to own all that property. Those people, they were just hiding all kinds of ways, but it was not the cave, the Underground Railroad. Can you imagine being stuck in a cave and you have no way to get out? It's free. Here you have somebody running after you, and you're like, you're just a big old target. No. Most people, I don't know why. And this is where education come into play, because some people actually think there is a railroad track that is the Underground Railroad. I'm like, no, not unless you're going to hell. You might have one going down there. Oh no! But anyway, let me stop acting silly.
No problem. Thank you.
My grandmother and grandfather in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, in the 1850s, on their farm, they had a room on the second floor with a secret doorway, and it really reminds you much more of if you see the movie about Diary of Anne Frank, where they hid upstairs. It wasn't down below, but it was a place that was very out of the way in the house, and that was very definitely used for hiding slaves during the Underground Railroad. And it wasn't like they had people every week for 5 years or anything, but occasionally they did. And I've seen it. It's still there.
So one other question is there any kind of map of suspected routes in central PA? Dorothy, I know you said the Park Service helps with it. Is there any kind of maps they've published since, that would help indicate what some of those sites are?
I'm not sure about a map per se, but there are a couple of books that have been written about the Underground Railroad. And I think, Barbara, didn't Eric write one? Eric Liddell Smith, he was a friend of
Yes,
ours
he
who's
did.
passed
Yes.
away.
Mhm.
So there are
Yes, he
some
did.
books out there that would document it, but I don't know specifically if there's a map.
And you know what? And people have put out what they call their maps. Even there's a group out of New York many years ago had put out a map concerning the Underground Railroad. Even tracing the passageways for Harriet Tubman. Okay, they have some of those areas mapped out supposedly. Maybe not to the inch, but they do have that type of thing. But as far as generally for everybody, let's say you have to Google it, and you'll probably find some interesting things out there concerning maps for runaway slaves and who was going like into the 8th Ward, what Caleb was going to talk about a bit of the 8th Ward in Harrisburg and some of the safe houses there, for the freedom seekers. And yes, there was those people sporadic throughout, but like David mentioned, it wasn't every day, every week, every year, and there was just different people that came and went. Follow the North Star. And I see that somebody did ask a question about going to Canada. Yes, they did not, like Mr. Thomas I spoke about, he did not stay here longer than 6 months because of the slave catcher. He was trying to get onto another area for freedom to stay free. There was a lot of people that I have read about that stayed in Harrisburg and kind of molded or fitted right in. And when they thought they were free, here comes a slave catcher like 10 years later and takes them back into slavery. So you had those people that were trying to get into Harrisburg and trying to make their way into New York. And they didn't all go to Philadelphia. They didn't all go to Pittsburgh. They went to other areas into New York and beyond into Canada. There's a huge community up there of African American or Africans, Canadians that still live there. They're the descendants of these here slaves that got away from here. So they went everywhere.
And was that, Barbara, was that coordinated? Like I know David mentioned that we had to kind of keep the sites secret. So how did that there's been a few questions about coordination work in order to keep people moving.
But I'm not really sure how they kept it going other than mostly by hearsay, through the meetings that they had with the Abolitionist Society, through people that were the station masters. Did you hear about my relative coming through? Do you know anything about this person? Help me find my relative. Maybe something came back to that person from wherever they were coming from here in Dauphin County or whatever, and they were able to then maybe make their way to that relative. But they talked about the quilt. Remember the quilt on the Oprah show many years ago? Oh, that way was going to get you from here to there. I'm like, yeah, right. You and every slave catcher in the world was going to know what the symbols meant, because there was no way that they were going to be able to document that and send it back to the next slave that was trying to get out. Or we're going to have a tattoo on your head, or your hair is going to be cornrowed some kind of way so that you have a map to get someplace. No, it's not going to happen. It's not. So anyway, I hope I'm not getting off subject here.
Yeah. Another question is, what was the penalty for whites who were harboring escaped slaves?
After the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, I think it was $1,000 fine or 1 year in prison, because the Fugitive Slave Act was cruel and
Yes, they might have to pay a fine, they may have, and or go to prison. And I've seen pictures of white people who had a brand on their hand. They were
Mhm.
branded for being abolitionists, so that people would know if you did it again. So that would be a deterrent. Yeah, yeah. But jumping back to the question before this, Shane,
Sure.
how did people know? I'm not sure exactly how the whole Underground Railroad network got set up in the first place, but once it was set up, people knew where the next stop would be. You knew you're going to meet these freedom seekers at this location, and you're going to either move them right away to the next location or keep them overnight or keep them for a couple of days if they're slave catchers around. But you knew where the next place was. You might not know where the place after that was, but you knew where the next place was, and that's really all you needed to know. You didn't need to know the whole thing. Now, you could know the whole thing, because as people got more savvy at doing this, then they might know the whole thing. They might be able to determine the whole thing. But people could send letters. They could send letters to someone in Philadelphia, for example. Some of the runaways or freedom seekers went to Philadelphia and then went north. Some went in the central Pennsylvania, just went directly north. But you could send, you might get a letter saying, was my package received? Or you might you might send a letter saying, in a week or so, I'm going to be sending you a package that's going to have 2 little dolls in it and 1 big doll, or something like that. And people would understand that you were sending people to them. So there was a code that they used. So they did know that. And kind of back to what Barbara said, there were no slave quilts. People did not hang slave quilts on banisters outside the house. Slaves traveled at night. They weren't traveling with lanterns, because that would call attention to them. Oftentimes they didn't even travel with the full moon, because then they would be seen. So they're traveling in the dead of night. They're not going anywhere near houses unless somehow they know this is a safe place. They're not going anywhere near a house. People don't have their front porch lights on saying, this is a good house, come here. That didn't happen.
Mhm. No.
All right. So the next one was, were the slave recovery agents a constant threat, or did it kind of come in different waves during different time periods?
A constant.
I think it depends on the area. Some areas had very staunch abolitionists, and they would go head to head with the slave catchers. So I think slave catchers were a little cautious in those areas. But in other areas, it could go either way, where you had to really be careful. If you were an abolitionist, you could get yourself in trouble. We've done several, you probably know I have a theater company, so we've done several plays that deal with slavery, and Barbara's been a consultant on many of those. And I mean, there are examples of people who have, that we've used in our plays, where white abolitionists have been literally tarred and feathered for trying to help freedom seekers. So it really depended on the area. You really had to be careful.
Mhm. Mhm. Especially if you were abolitionists in the southern states, or the abolitionists traveling to the southern
Oh yeah,
states, you
yeah.
could get yourself hung along with the slave, or
Yeah.
you could get so many lashes. But typically they did not give them the 39 lashes or 38 lashes that they would give the slave here in Pennsylvania. Like Dorothy said, they would just find you and maybe imprison you for a period of time, but they were going to take something away from you. In some cases, they actually made them an indentured servant,
Right.
to use up their time.
Right. And I want to make sure that I say too that abolitionists were white and they were Black.
Hmm.
Because some people feel that abolitionists were only white. No, there were Black abolitionists, because oftentimes when freedom seekers were escaping, they would find a community, a Black community, into which they could escape, where they would look like everybody else in the community. And they could kind of hide for a little while until they could move on. So abolitionists were Black and they were white.
That's like the Mr. William Jones I had talked about for Mr. Thomas. You know, he got to William
Right.
Jones and William Jones got him over to the Rutherford. So
Right.
they come in all different colors,
Right.
shapes, and forms.
Okay, another question. Do you know where the Rutherford farms were specifically located?
Norman?
Is William Rutherford's farm is still there. It's, I think it was a jail for some time and now it's a halfway house, I think. And it's located under Route 87 in Paxton or in Swatara.
Route 87. So,
US 87, didn't that, I'm not that familiar, but I think it runs east and west.
well, we have a 283, we have an 83, we have an 81, 79.
Maybe
15.
it's one, I'm sorry, my geography is not that good.
That's okay.
It is there and it remains, the structure remains. It's near Paxtang Park, which no longer is.
Oh, you're talking about the Rutherford House. David, you know where you turn off at Paxton Street across from Burger King and you go under and at the Paxton.
Yeah, that the Rutherford House, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
That is still there.
Yes, it's still there. And the little cabin behind it where there's pictures of people that have been workers on the farm slash, as Caleb said, they could have been slaves. He doesn't know, but there's a picture of them standing around that little water house out in the back, away from the actual Rutherford house that became a senior citizen
Yes, yeah.
building. Right. Okay.
All right, we have a few minutes left. So another question was, beyond Google, are there any specific libraries, archives, or digital humanities projects that are known to be good sources of Underground Railroad sites in Pennsylvania?
Mm. Not that I can think of, other than just going into your historical societies and into the main archives like out of Philadelphia or even in Washington, D.C. That if you if you know of a name or something that could give you a link to get in there, but to go in there blindly would be kind of hard. But I can't think of anything else other than like what I do, and I really dig into research a lot in different avenues. So I don't
The
know.
Historical Society of Pennsylvania in downtown Philadelphia, they have the entire archival collection of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which was founded by Quakers and Benjamin Franklin in the 1770s. And there's a lot of information at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania about this whole subject. In terms of this area of central Pennsylvania, certainly Historical Society of Dauphin County would have some information above and beyond what you might find in the internet. And I will mention also that Dorothy and I were talking a couple of days ago about possibly putting together some field trips. First of all, to see some of the Underground Railroad sites and African-American history sites here in the Harrisburg area, many of which we've talked about tonight. And then also to go see similar sites in York, Pennsylvania, and in Gettysburg. So we're working on that, but those of you who are interested in this subject matter, stay tuned, because we want to keep offering more activities like this when we're able to put them together.
Well, David, let me know, because I have given tours in Harrisburg concerning the Underground Railroad / African history from the 1800s. I've also
Perfect.
given tours to Dickinson College when I was their community liaison for a number of years to the students down there in Gettysburg. And I can show you some really hot places down there.
Definitely, Barbara. Great.
Let me just answer too, Shane. Two places, neither of which is in central Pennsylvania, but Charles Bloxton has a collection at Temple University in Philly on Black history, an extensive collection. So that might be a place to check. And of course, there's always the Freedom Center, which is in Cincinnati. I know people might not be able to travel there. Obviously, we can't really travel too much now. I don't know how much of their documents are online. but that's a place to go. And then if you want to see artifacts, there's the African American Museum in Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
All right, thank you,
And also,
Dorothy. Oh,
just
go
to
ahead.
let you know, Pennsylvania State Archives, um, they are in the process of doing a lot of transcribing of actual records from the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society that they have. And I was questioning them several months ago, and they told me that they don't have them all, they don't have them done. And because of the movement of everything right now, and with the new archives going up, that has not been the focus of their things right now. But they do have quite a bit, a large collection that they're going to have transcribed so that we can get to online soon. Well, let's say within the next couple of years. Okay.
All right, thank you. So everyone, we'd like to thank you for joining. Before we go, we do want to remind you that we do have a presentation the fourth Monday of every month. Next month's presentation is going to be hosted by Guinea Roth, and she's presenting on 4 generations of strong women in Harrisburg, and that will be Monday, March 22nd at 6 p.m. You can access it on the same webpage you came to today. We always update that as our programs advance. And later this week, we will also be posting the recording from today's session. So if you have any friends or others that would be interested in viewing it, please do share it with them. But I'd like to thank you, members of our audience, for joining us tonight. You really are what do make these events successful and what helps us get such great speakers to come out. And I do want to thank everyone who made it happen and all of our speakers tonight. So Norman, Dorothy, Barbara, David, and Janice, thank you all for speaking and thank you for your contribution. And have a great evening, everyone.
Mhm.
And be safe out there in the weather. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
happy
Thank you for having
Happy
me.
Black History Month.
Yeah.
Well, Kim,
Bye.